The dogs knew before anyone else did. That was the part nobody could explain afterward. Not the handlers, not the commanding officers, not the journalist who showed up to cover what was supposed to be a routine memorial ceremony in Halifax. 7 Belgian Malinois, all active-duty RCMP K9 units, all perfectly trained, all supposed to be standing at rigid attention beside their partners while the speeches went on. And then, without warning, without any signal that any human could identify, all 7 of them turned their heads in exactly the same direction, toward the back of the crowd, toward a young woman standing alone near the chain-link fence at the edge of garrison grounds, wearing a second-hand fleece jacket 2 sizes too big, holding a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Nobody paid her any attention. Why would they? There were dignitaries on the stage. There were cameras. There were rows of officers in dress uniforms standing so straight. They looked like they'd been carved from the same piece of granite. The ceremony was honoring 12 RCMP K9 teams who had completed active service in drug interdiction and search and rescue operations across 3 provinces. It was a big deal. There were flowers, there was a military band, and nobody noticed the woman at the fence. Her name was Mara Calloway. She was 29 years old, and she had driven 7 hours from a rented room in a town outside Truro to stand at the back of a public ceremony she hadn't been invited to, just so she could watch dogs she used to know live their lives without her. The first dog to move was a male Malinois named Rook. His handler, Corporal Dennis Beaumont, felt the leash go taut and looked down expecting to see Rook tracking a scent on the ground. That was protocol. You check the environment first, then the animal. But Rook wasn't tracking. Rook was straining forward with his whole chest, ears pinned forward, eyes locked somewhere behind the crowd. Beaumont tightened his grip and whispered a correction. Rook ignored him. That had never happened before in 2 years of partnership. Then the dog beside Rook started pulling, then the one beside her. Within 40 seconds, all 7 dogs were facing the same direction. All of them pulling, all of them making the same low sound in their throats. Not a bark, not a growl, something older and harder to name. The handlers exchanged looks over the heads of the crowd. One of them, Sergeant Yolanda Marsh, quietly activated her radio and said something that no one standing nearby could quite hear. The speeches stopped. People turned around, and Mara Calloway, who had spent the last 2 years trying very hard to be invisible, suddenly had 400 people looking directly at her. She didn't run. That surprised people later when they talked about it. She just stood there with her paper cup and looked back at them, and then she looked at the dogs, and something happened in her face. A shift, a softening, and she set the cup down on the ground very carefully, like she was afraid of making noise. Rook broke first. Beaumont would say afterward that he had never in his career lost control of a working dog. He would say it the way someone says a thing they need to be true, and everyone in the room would understand exactly what he meant. Rook yanked the leash out of his hand and crossed the ceremony grounds in about 4 seconds flat. And then he was at the fence, pressing his whole face against the chain link, whimpering like a puppy. The other 6 dogs followed before their handlers could do anything at all. 7 leashes trailing on the ground, 7 highly trained RCMP animals, worth somewhere north of $40,000 each in training alone, pressed against a fence making sounds that grown officers would later describe, in their incident reports, as distress vocalizations. That was the official language. What they looked like was dogs that had found someone they thought they'd lost. There is a facility outside Dartmouth, Nova Scotia that most people don't know exists. It doesn't have a sign on the road. It sits back from the highway behind a tree line, 3 low buildings and a series of fenced exercise yards, and for 11 years it operated as one of the most successful K9 training programs in Atlantic Canada. The program was called Bridgeline. It was not military, not police, not government. It had been built and run almost entirely by one person, a woman named Dr. Carol Calloway, who had a background in animal behavior science and a stubbornness that her colleagues described, depending on how they felt about her, as either inspiring or exhausting. Carol had one daughter. Mara grew up at Bridgeline the way other kids grow up at the family business. She did her homework in the office while her mother took calls. She learned to read a dog's body language before she learned long division. She knew how to move around a working animal, how to drop her energy, how to use silence the way other people used commands. By the time she was 12, the dogs responded to her the same way they responded to her mother. By the time she was 16, she was helping run training sessions for handlers who were 15 years older than her. It was not a normal childhood. Mara would not have traded it for anything. The facility trained dogs for RCMP units across Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. They specialized in Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds, animals that required a specific combination of drive, stability, and socialization that took years to develop properly. Carol had an approach that was unusual in the industry. She believed that working dogs needed deep individual relationships before they could be deployed effectively, not just with their eventual handlers, but with the people who raised them through the critical development period. She called it bonded foundation training. The academic establishment thought it was sentimental. The dogs it produced were extraordinary. Mara worked alongside her mother for 4 years after finishing her degree in animal behavior. She was the one who raised the youngest cohort, 8 puppies that arrived at Bridgeland when they were 8 weeks old, 3 years before the Halifax ceremony. She named them. She socialized them. She was the first person they saw every morning and the last voice they heard at night. She tracked their development, ran them through foundation work, identified their individual drives, matched their emerging personalities to the kinds of roles they'd eventually fill. She loved those dogs the way you love something you built from the ground up with your own hands. And then, 14 months before the Halifax ceremony, Carol Calloway had a stroke. It was not a minor one. It left her with significant deficits: speech, mobility, memory. She spent 3 months in hospital and came home to a modified apartment, unable to return to the facility. The program that she had run on relationships and reputation and barely any institutional backing turned out to have almost no formal structure underneath it. No board of directors, no endowment, contracts with RCMP units that were grandfathered on personal trust rather than legal agreements. A building lease that was technically in Carol's name alone. Within 6 weeks of her stroke, the whole operation began to come apart. There were people who could have stepped in. Some of them tried. But without Carol, the institutional relationships unraveled faster than anyone anticipated. And the funding that had always been tenuous became impossible, and the facility that had operated on passion and muscle memory for 11 years suddenly couldn't make payroll. Mara held it together for 4 months. She ran the program alone. She handled the dogs, managed the training schedules, took the calls from RCMP coordinators, drove her mother to physiotherapy 3 times a week, and slept somewhere between 4 and 5 hours a night. She did this without complaint, because there was no one to complain to, and because the alternative was watching everything her mother had built disappear. In the end, it disappeared anyway. The RCMP found a larger certified facility in Ontario that could absorb the existing contracts. They were professional about it. They thanked Mara personally. They said they hoped the transition would be smooth. They offered to cover transport costs for the dogs, which was generous, and they said it in a tone that made it clear the conversation was finished. The 8 dogs Mara had raised from puppies were transferred to the Ontario facility, reassessed, paired with new handlers, and deployed into active service. 7 of them made it through the full training pipeline. The 8th, a female named Maple, who had always been the most sensitive, was retired early and adopted into a family outside Ottawa. Mara moved her mother into a long-term care residence in Dartmouth. She packed up the office. She cleaned out the kennels. She locked the building on a Wednesday afternoon in November, handed the keys to the property management company, and sat in her car in the parking lot for a long time without starting it. Then she drove to Truro and rented a room and got a job at a distribution warehouse and tried to figure out what came next. She almost didn't go to Halifax. She had seen the announcement online. An RCMP K9 memorial ceremony recognizing 12 teams who had completed active service. She recognized some of the names in the program. 3 of the dogs listed were from Bridgeline's final cohort, 3 of hers. She told herself she wasn't going to go. She told herself it would be strange, that no one would know who she was, that she had no official reason to be there. She told herself this for about 3 weeks, and then she got in her car at 5 in the morning and drove to Halifax and stood at the back of the crowd with a coffee she couldn't drink. She wasn't there to be recognized. She just wanted to see them. She had been standing at the fence for about 20 minutes when Rook looked up. She knew him by his ears. She had always known Rook by his ears. They were slightly asymmetrical, the left one just a fraction higher than the right, a quirk that had showed up when he was 12 weeks old and never corrected itself. She had spent hours looking at those ears. She knew them the way you know the face of someone you love. Rook looked at her from across the ceremony grounds, and something in his whole body changed. And then all the rest of them were looking too, and the leashes were on the ground. And there was no going back to the ceremony being what it was supposed to be. The officer who reached her first was a woman. Staff Sergeant Patricia Okafor, who had been standing near the back of the official section, and moved quickly when the dogs broke. She positioned herself between Mara and the fence in a way that was professional and calm and also clearly not optional, and she said, in a very even voice, "Ma'am, can I ask what your connection is to these animals?" Mara said, "I raised them." Okafor looked at her. Then she looked at the fence, where 7 fully trained RCMP K9 units were pressing their faces against the chain link and making sounds that nobody in her career had ever prepared her for. Then she looked back at Mara. "What do you mean? You raised them? From 8 weeks old?" "My mother's facility. Bridgeline in Dartmouth. Those 3. Mara pointed without pointing, just a slight tilt of her chin. "Rook, Duchess, and the big one, Cole. They were my first cohort. The others came through 6 months later. I ran foundation training for all of them." Okafor was quiet for a moment. Bridgeline closed. "Yes. What's your name, Mara Calloway?" "Carol Calloway was my mother. Is my mother. She's still alive." Something shifted in Okafor's expression. She reached for her radio. What followed was the kind of organized confusion that happens when an official event encounters something it has no protocol for. People were consulted. Calls were made. 2 of the handlers came over and introduced themselves with the specific careful politeness of people who are not sure what is happening and don't want to make it worse. Beaumont, Rook's handler, shook Mara's hand and said, "He's never done that. In 2 years, he's never done anything like that." And Mara said, "He wouldn't have until today." And Beaumont looked at her like he was trying to decide if that was a rebuke, and then decided it wasn't. The ceremony coordinator, a civilian named Gerald Hatch, appeared with a clipboard and a deeply troubled expression. He spoke for about 90 seconds about the integrity of official programming and the logistical difficulty of unexpected variables. Nobody listened to him. The dogs were still at the fence. Commander Louise Tran, who was the senior RCMP officer on site and had been standing on the stage when Rook broke, arrived without ceremony and stood quietly for a moment looking at the situation. She was a small woman with close-cropped grey hair and the particular stillness of someone who had been managing crises long enough to stop showing them on her face. She looked at the dogs. She looked at Mara. She said, "Are you the one who trained them?" "My mother designed the program. I implemented it. The foundation work, that was me." Tran nodded. She turned to Okafor. "Open the gate." Hatch said, "Commander, the schedule, Gerald." She didn't raise her voice. "Open the gate." The latch turned and 7 dogs hit Mara Calloway all at once. She went down to one knee immediately, not because she was knocked over, but because she knew them. Knew that Rook would come in from the left, knew that Cole would try to climb her shoulder, knew that Duchess would put her whole head in Mara's neck and stay there until the world made sense again. She knew which ones wanted to be held and which ones needed to move, and she managed all of them at once with her hands and her voice, and the kind of fluency that doesn't come from training manuals. She was talking to them the whole time, not commands, just words. The same low, steady narration she had used when they were puppies, describing what was happening, acknowledging them, telling them she was there. The handlers stood back and watched their animals in a state of complete abandon and tried to reconcile it with everything they thought they understood about working dogs and detachment and professional behavior. Beaumont said later that watching Rook with Mara was like watching a person reunite with a parent. He used that word. He was a man in his 40s with 15 years in the RCMP, and he used the word parent, and he wasn't embarrassed about it. There is a question that got asked many times in the weeks after Halifax, in the reports and the follow-up conversations, and the one interview Mara eventually agreed to give to a journalist in Dartmouth. How did they know? How did 7 dogs, working animals trained to focus entirely on their handlers and their environment, recognize a woman they hadn't seen in over a year across a crowded ceremony ground from at least 40 meters away? The honest answer is that nobody knows exactly. Animal behaviorists offered explanations involving olfactory memory, which is real and documented and genuinely remarkable in dogs. A Malinois can hold a scent signature in memory for years and identify it under extraordinary interference. Others pointed to the combination of sensory cues, the way Mara stood, the way she moved, the specific frequency of her breathing, the shape of her stillness in a crowd of people who were all moving and talking and generating noise. Mara had a different answer, which she gave simply and without apology. "They knew me," she said. "You spend that much time with a dog, especially in the first year, you become part of how they understand the world. I was the constant when everything else was new and uncertain. That doesn't go away. That's not something you train out of them." She paused. "And I don't think you should." In the months following the ceremony, Commander Tran initiated a review of how Bridgelin's closure had been handled. The review found several things that nobody was proud of. Contracts that should have had succession clauses, institutional relationships that should have been formalized, a program that had been allowed to depend entirely on one person's goodwill and energy in a way that left no protection when that person's capacity changed. The review also found that the foundation training methods Carol Calloway had developed, and that Mara had implemented, produced measurable and documented outcomes in K9 performance that the Ontario facility had not been able to replicate at the same rate. Mara was asked if she would be willing to consult on a new training protocol. She said she would think about it. She drove to Dartmouth, sat with her mother for 3 hours, showed her the photos from Halifax on her phone. Carol couldn't say much. Her speech was still slow, still searching, but she looked at the photo of Mara surrounded by all 7 dogs, and she made a sound that was clear enough. Mara said yes. She began working with the RCMP the following spring as an independent contractor, developing a formalized version of her mother's methodology, the one that had always worked, the one that had been considered too soft, too relationship-focused, too much of a woman's idea about how things should be done. The first cohort of dogs she trained under the new protocol went into active service 8 months later. All 6 of them completed deployment. 3 of them received commendations in their first year. Rook retired from active service 3 years after Halifax, at the age of 7. Beaumont adopted him, which is standard when a handler and dog have worked together long enough, and which was not complicated by anything, because Rook was Beaumont's dog in every way that mattered. And Beaumont knew that the look at the fence had not been a correction of that. It had been something older. On the day Beaumont came to pick Rook up from the transition facility, he found Mara there. She had driven down to say goodbye, or rather to say something that didn't have an easy name. The thing you say to an animal when a chapter closes and another one opens, and you want them to know you're glad about how it all turned out. She crouched down and held Rook's face in her hands. He was graying at the muzzle now, the asymmetrical ears still slightly mismatched, still recognizable as the puppy she had carried home in a crate 11 weeks after he was born. She said something to him that Beaumont couldn't hear. He didn't try to listen. He stood back and gave her the space for it, and when she stood up and stepped away, Rook sat very straight and watched her go, and he didn't whine, and he didn't pull. He understood. That was the thing about those dogs. They had always understood more than people gave them credit for. Mara walked back to her truck and didn't look behind her, and the sky over Nova Scotia was that particular shade of late afternoon grey that looks like the inside of a promise, and somewhere in the trees at the edge of the lot a bird was making a sound that carried farther than it should have. She had work to do in the morning. There were 6 new puppies at the facility, 8 weeks old, wide-eyed, stumbling over their own feet, and not one of them yet knew who she was. They would.